In 2007, the first Mass Effect was released and almost instantly became a critical hit. Between the homage to classic 80s sci-fi and its compelling protagonist and conflict, the first entry into BioWare's contemporary canon spawned a series that is at once beloved and harshly criticized due to its controversial conclusion. 10 years after the first game's release came a new adventure into the universe that would take players far, far away from the original trilogy and the effects of Commander Shepard's final stand. And to say that it didn't go well would be an understatement. Mass Effect Andromeda's release brought with it a number of aesthetic bugs that immediately transformed it from a highly anticipated expansion of a beloved franchise into a meme, existing only to be mocked and belittled by fans who were never going to be satisfied to begin with. The backlash to the game was so severe that as soon as a majority of the bugs were patched and some quality of life changes were implemented, all development on the title was suspended and BioWare's Montreal studio was dissolved. The devs who had spent years working on the game were either relocated to other BioWare and EA studios, or they left the company entirely. Andromeda now exists as this strange, almost cult classic of a game. With the backlash to the initial release now having died out, there have been a number of retrospectives looking back on the game as players are taking the time to sit with it as it is, rather than as what they wanted it to be. And what Andromeda is a coming-of-age story set against a backdrop of fighting against zealous fascism, while the narrative makes an effort to reconcile with the company's legacy of colonialism that's been in the making for years. So first, a quick recap of the game. In the year 2183, a mysterious benefactor provided enough funding to a group known as the Andromeda Initiative to allow for the construction of 4 arcs to carry thousands of members of galactic society across dark space to explore and ultimately settle in Helios, a star cluster in the Andromeda galaxy that they discovered to be home to a remarkably high number of garden worlds in the Goldilocks zone. With the power of faster-than-light travel, half a millennium later, the human ark arrives to discover that their golden worlds have been corrupted by something that they come to call the Scourge. Twisted, dark matter has spread like a massive interstellar weed across open space, as well as all over planets in the cluster. But reality coming undone isn't their only source of trouble. Upon landing to survey the planet's surface, it's found that the Initiative isn't the first to have discovered Helios. An alien force that we call the Kett are immediately a hostile threat, and attempts at peaceful communication result in shots being fired. Thankfully, your dad is in charge of the situation, hypothesizing that the alien tech that you passed by on your way here is affecting the atmosphere. The Kett haven't been able to activate it, but Alec is certain that with the help of his AI Sam, he'll be able to get it back up and running, and maybe even reverse some of the damage that's been done. Unfortunately, brute forcing his way into the tech triggers something that sends you both falling to the ground. With Rieder now at risk of suffocating to death, Alex sacrifices himself for the child that he was never there for in life. As a result of this, Sam is transferred into your brain, thereby passing his mantle on to you. You are humanity's pathfinder now. Thus begins a story that sees the player making allies and enemies with the locals, fighting space Nazis, and trying to wrangle in the alien technology so that it stops corrupting the local ecology. Along the way, you spend time growing closer to your crewmates and learning to become the leader that your father believed that you could be. Before we can move on to why I enjoy this game so much for what it represents, I want to go ahead and get the criticism out of the way, partly because I believe that understanding something's nuances and being able to look at them with a critical eye allows for a deeper appreciation of media. So, to start off with, we have the most obvious in that Mass Effect Andromeda has been often likened to as a space western. You've got the wild frontier, you've got the native population with unfamiliar customs, you've got gunslinging outlaws, you've got NPCs named things like Colt, Dalton. It's not exactly being subtle here, which is going to be the biggest critique we have of the narrative and the setting, because the Western genre is one that's steeped in colonial attitudes. Popularized by classic Hollywood serials and directors like Clint Eastwood, the Western became a genre of near fantasy that mythologized the lone wolf cowboy, a man taking the law into his own hands in the untamed lands beyond civilization. He would certainly be white, and he would do a lot more brooding and shooting than he ever actually would doing cow wrangling. These stories also grossly mischaracterize the indigenous people living in these regions, and actors in brownface have been a staple all the way up to the 2010s. The reality of the cowboy era is that your average cowboy wasn't even white. The vast majority of vaqueros were either Latino, Black, or even Chinese immigrants. There have recently been some attempts to bring color into the modern Western, with movies featuring leading casts of mostly Black and brown actors to tell stories that allow them to participate in this heroic mythology. But on the whole, this genre still carries with it that legacy of problematic elements, and it's tricky to integrate such things into a narrative that is definitively about colonialism. And yet, Andromeda does try its best to be aware of those pitfalls that it could so easily fall into. All of these characters have grown up in a universe where our real-life history has absolutely happened. They're all aware of the atrocities that were committed in the name of expansionism. The job of the initiative's Director of Colonial Affairs, who, side note, has a British accent, which I personally find to be very ironic. Her role is more akin to that of an ambassador, directing advocates for the initiative to the local Angara, the native spacefaring species who've been under siege by the Kett for approximately 4 generations at this point. The initiative, in contrast, aren't trying to be conquerors, and they often position themselves as being a, quote, civilian organization, rather than a militant one. Any settling must be done with the Angara's blessing, as they have explicit rights to the garden worlds that the initiative has ventured out here to find. There is a bit of ludonarrative dissonance felt between the initiative's goals and the actual narrative and gameplay loops. First of all, being a Mass Effect game means that Andromeda is first and foremost a third-person shooter. Everything else is built up around this feature of the game, and in terms of development, the combat is perhaps the most well-put-together aspect of the entire game. It's smooth and dynamic, and these skills are incredibly fun to play around with. However, the game itself wants to be about exploration and discovery, and violence is found around nearly every single corner. Rieder was formerly in the Alliance's military. They're a soldier, as are many others in the Initiative. For an organization that prides itself on being an entity that wants to engage in non-violent colonialism, which kind of an oxymoron, you shoot a lot of people, including a group of anti-colonial renegades who rightfully just trust you for coming into their home unannounced after spending decades fighting against a force that has been hellbent on destroying them. A lot of this dissonance comes from Mass Effect Andromeda's troubled development. The initial plan for the game was to be similar to No Man's Sky, another game that was poorly received on launch, and it would have featured procedurally generated planets for you to discover and explore. This concept ultimately had to be trashed, as the worlds being generated weren't reaching the level of graphical quality that the game required, and the Frostbite engine that the team was using was leading to a number of difficulties just in general. All of that, as well as communication troubles and inter-studio meddling, on top of devs being reallocated to the unfortunate dumpster fire that was Anthem, led to the version of Andromeda that we're discussing to have been made in about 18 months of serious crunch. And if you know anything about game development, especially when it comes to AAA, then you'll recognize the absolute goddamn miracle it is that this game is half as good as it is. I couldn't skirt around the backstory for this game's creation in this video because I feel that recognizing what went into creating this provides a great deal of information when engaging in critique of it. Also, please be kind to game developers and advocate for unionization and the elimination of crunch culture. Links to organizations that you can support down below, thanks. To me, it feels like there was a great deal of pressure involved in Andromeda's development to make it a recognizable Mass Effect game, and they did so by compromising their creative vision for the narrative to ensure that the gameplay was reminiscent enough of the trilogy that it felt connected. This culminates in a messy presentation, with a setting and story that want to say something, but which stumbles continuously as we go through it. One of Rieder's primary goals is to allow their people to come out of cryo by establishing settlements on a few planets throughout the cluster. In order to do this, they have to increase the viability of each planet that they're trying to settle on. This is done by eliminating local Kett presences, gathering research data, and by interfacing with remnant technology via SAM, who, as an artificial intelligence, is capable of spending the processing power that it takes to interact with the global terraforming network. The latter causes a great deal of conflicting morality due to the fact that terraforming is an inherently colonialist act, disrupting native ecosystems in order to convert the land into a state that is viable for forms of life that are perceived as being acceptable. Given that the vaults were corrupted centuries ago, the local ecology has spent that time adapting to the changes. It's never really clarified whether or not the remnant technology was initially terraforming the planets before their settings malfunctioned, or if the vaults were put in place to maintain the local ecology and then they were corrupted. Either way, the fact that they're here leads to some iffy conclusions as to the validity of Rieder using the vaults for their own needs. The Jaardan were the creators of these constructs, and the act of resetting them is portrayed to the player, at least, as being restorative rather than a conversion. Rieder's secondary objective is aiding the Angara in their war against the Kett, attempting to eliminate their presence from Helios to stop the genocide of their people and reclaim their homeworlds. Rieder's first interaction with the Angara isn't actually their first contact with the Milky Way species, but it is notable that Rieder is actively attempting to work with the Angara and establish a mutually beneficial relationship with them. It's important in this story for the Angara to have as much agency as possible over the situation in order to displace the common tropes that often surround narratives like this one. It would be incredibly easy for Rieder to slip into the role of the white savior, and at times it kind of feels like they do. But what keeps them from falling entirely into that trope is that the Angara continue to have control over their own liberation from the Kett. The Resistance has outposts all over Helios, and just because Rieder is able to swoop in and be a hero for a day, doesn't necessarily take away from the fact that this is still the Angara's fight. Most of Rieder's swooping happens in order to provide aid to the Angara and cut a path for them to make progress. Though there are a few strongholds where the player feels a bit like a deus ex machina, it's almost exemplary of the ludonarrative dissonance that I mentioned before. The game requires Rieder to be the hero because it needs the player to feel a sense of accomplishment so that they continue playing the game in search of that next rush of success. I feel that for this reason, Rieder can be forgiven for the times that they somehow miraculously achieve something in a few hours that a highly informed and trained military force couldn't in months of fighting. But while the gameplay flounders in its attempts to juggle these tropes, the more personal narratives find success. The Angara do not trust Rieder, and I think that's the most significant aspect of the relationship that they have with these people. Trust is something that has to be earned in situations where there's been a great deal of trauma involved. When the Kett first arrived in Helios, their initial interactions with the Angara were peaceful. It wasn't until much later that they finally attacked, and by then it was too late. Throughout the game, Rieder has to prove to the Angara that they are non-hostile to them, and that they're willing to provide meaningful aid and to make meaningful change. I especially enjoy Jaal's character writing for this reason. He wants to play an active role in his people's liberation, but he hasn't found a personally satisfying way to do that with the Resistance, despite being an excellent fighter and a very well-respected agent. So he joins up with Rieder's team, taking them on as his assignment to evaluate whether or not the initiative can be believed. And in the beginning, he holds his cards close to his chest. Jaal doesn't immediately spill his backstory to you in the way that we're so used to RPG characters doing. Instead, he treats Rieder with suspicion and is even kind of cagey. But as you progress through the story and show him that your intentions are genuine, he opens up and even becomes quite friendly. Or potentially romantic. No, I will not stop enthusing about my pixelated boyfriends in my essays. You're in my domain now. But I find it especially notable in the context of the overarching narrative that the game has given these characters the space for that trust and hesitation. Considering everything that they've gone through, it's really important for the Angara to get a say in what help they do or don't accept in this war. And I'm gonna take a moment here to get a bit spicy with this next take, because I think that the Kett are a more terrifying antagonistic force than the Reapers.
Wait, you're not gonna...
I guess it just did.
Okay, look. I understand that for a lot of players, the Kett were pretty underwhelming as far as bad guys go. I mean, just look at the Archon. Look at this dude. He's like a capuchin monkey with a halo. He's fucking adorable. How am I supposed to feel threatened by this guy? Well, because of this.
The Moshai said we should speak. You remember the Kett's arrival.
One of them came to our city on a vow to offer lavish gifts. We lined up along the street to watch the alien walk with our ambassador. As it passed, It stopped and knelt in front of me. I still dream of what it said. Young one, you are meant for greatness.
Now I know why my arrival had everyone on edge.
When I saw you walk with Paran through our city, I hoped that the gods would kill you. I will never trust outsiders again.
The original trilogy's narrative deals a great deal more with philosophy and morality than it actually does the greater threat of the Reapers. Whether you realize it or not, the first series is about determinism, continuity of the self, and most crucially about at what point can an artificial construct be considered alive. What it means to be alive and how that shapes the relationships that you create, those are what the original trilogy is about, more so than it is about the Reaper War. Hell, the second game doesn't even see you confront the Reapers as a threat directly, using the Collectors as a middleman, while the actual story of Mass Effect 2 is about how effective you are at gaining and maintaining the loyalty of your team members. And I love Mass Effect 2, don't get me wrong. It's probably my favorite Mass Effect game narrative-wise, and I think it might even be the strongest as a potential standalone game in the whole series. When taken as part of the whole, it's far more of a diversion from the main plot than I think most folks would consider it to be, and yet it's still the fan favorite, and I think that has a lot to do with the way that it chooses its themes and sticks with them. In Andromeda, the Kett are intrinsically important to our narrative from the very first mission. The cutscene post our collapse positions them as our main baddies, wordlessly telling us that this guy is after the same thing that we are, the terraforming tech within the vaults. This would place them in our path no matter what, but when we encounter the Angara, we begin to learn the full extent of what the Kett are doing here. They're an invading, imperialist, colonialist force utilizing extreme fascism as their weapon of choice. There are some comparisons to be made between the Kett and the Reapers. For one, the violent assimilation of their victims and the utilization of their bodies against those that they intend to convert. But I think what I find scarier about the Kett is the fanaticism and the clear intent behind it all. The Reapers were acting as a result of, essentially, bad coding. Their prime directive to protect sapient life from its own hubris became a systematic extermination to create a cycle of life and death. But the Kett have chosen this path. They treat their actions with a zealous, religious fervor that has convinced them of their own superiority. They act because they have been told that their mission is to purify life and make it fit the standards that they have set. This is eugenics, by the way, just in case that wasn't clear. It has occurred to me that I should probably explain what eugenics is. So, eugenics is the scientifically inaccurate theory that humanity can be improved by selective breeding practices, like a sort of artificial evolution, and it's often referenced by racists and ableists with fantasies about genetic purity. This theory has been a thorn in the scientific community's side since the 1800s, and it came to a head with the rise of the Nazis and their campaigns that murdered millions and sterilized at least 400,000 individuals, the majority of which were Jewish, queer, or other marginalized identities. In the United States, at least 60,000 people were sterilized by the 1970s due to panics about race and disabilities. These practices in the States largely targeted minority communities. Eugenics is a practice that defines a form of life that is ideal, and anything that does not fit that is unworthy of living. This grossly implies that there is not only a right way of being a human being, but that anyone who doesn't meet that standard is surely incapable of living a life that has meaning. Let's be clear about this right here and now. Taking away someone's agency is disgusting, and all lives deserve to exist. Being of a marginalized identity, be that racialized or disabled, does not make you any less worthy of being a human being. And if you disagree with me, then you may as well stop watching this video because I do not want you here. This forceful rewrite of one's genetic code to the point where under close examination nothing remains identifiable is horrifying to me. These aren't machines programmed into a logical fallacy. These are people, thinking and feeling with their own twisted versions of morality and acting horrors upon other people. Unlike the Reapers, who essentially try and fail to dunk on you without ever saying anything meaningful, you can have conversations with a few Kett throughout the game. They're higher up on the food chain and believe that what they're doing to the Angara is a holy mission of some kind. And that mission is genocide. It's not just extermination for the sake of murder, it is a systematic destruction that seeks to eradicate the cultures and identities of the Angara and of all other forms of life that they come across. Labor camps see kidnapped prisoners being worked to death for the Kett, while those chosen quite literally have everything that they are stripped away and converted into a horrifying idea of purity. And this has been ongoing for generations. Rieder gets the chance about 3/4 of the way through the game to speak with Angaran elders, who are the only ones left who remember a time before their people were forced into a fight for everything that they are. It is haunting to see what has been lost in this fight. From people mourning loved ones to those who have been fighting for survival from the very beginning. The Reaper War of 2186 in comparison is incredibly short-lived, and while millions of lives were lost, the time between the start of the true invasion and Shepard's last stand is maybe a year of time, if that. Time has taken its toll on the Angara in their fight, and as their numbers dwindle, it's obvious that they'd not likely survived without allies. It's very interesting to me that a game ostensibly about participating in colonialism puts you up against the absolute worst, most toxic colonial fuckers in the goddamn galaxy. But honestly, I'm here for it. In preparation for this video, I've been doing a lot of research into the way that science fiction and speculative fiction in general has been affected by colonialist ideology. And as one might expect, particularly with space opera, that urge to venture into the unknown and toy with the possibilities of living in strange new worlds is rooted in attitudes that have a dark history. It's really interesting to engage with a set of protagonists that are utterly aware of their role within the universe that they live in, and that even with all of their missteps and ignorances, they're still trying to find a better way, because they want to create a future where everyone can flourish and thrive. Those goals at cooperation in the face of evil is a regular theme in BioWare's canon, but it really stands out here, and it mirrors Rieder's own personal journey as they grow into their role as Pathfinder. And reconciling with the pervasive history of colonialism hasn't exactly been BioWare's strong suit up until this point. With regards to the original Mass Effect trilogy, one of the issues of calling back to 80s sci-fi is that you bring a lot of the era's ideals with you in the process. One of the main things that we can see, especially in the first game, is the widespread adoption of capitalism as the primary economic system throughout the entire galaxy. Reaganomics in the 80s completely grabbed the West by the throat, and the effects of that are still suffocating us to this day. There's a fascinating contrast between this and the sci-fi era that came before it, with the 60s Star Trek socialist utopia, where things back home are in such a state of prosperity that we have simply nothing better to do than to venture out into the stars and boldly go. In Mass Effect, it seems like the exploration is almost exclusively profit-driven, given the prevalence of corporations and bureaucracy that we encounter throughout the trilogy. Besides, humanity's expansion requires resources, and resources are easy enough to get when you just take them by force. And to that end, it seems as though the rest of the galaxy has already been at this for millennia. There's not even anyone to stop Shepard from decimating the resources of an entire solar system in the hopes of nabbing a shiny new weapon upgrade. From the other Council species, we can see that they're either completely desensitized to the effects of colonialism, or they're not even really aware of the scale of the impact that they've had. The Asari have been here for the longest, and they're a capitalist powerhouse, with colonies dedicated to perpetuating the system. As for the Turians, they're more explicitly forceful. Modeled thematically after ancient Rome, they're a conquering force who by their own prideful of mission have said that they, quote, don't lose wars. Like Russia invading Ukraine, they just pretend that this was the plan all along when things don't go as they were expecting them to. A case worth examining for the Turians is the relationship with the Volus. After their first contact with these ammonia-based mole people, they seem to have come to an accord by establishing the Volus as a protectorate. While no one in the series complains about the arrangement, with the Turians providing their superior military forces to an ally should they need it, there's a pretty stark power imbalance to this relationship. It's a little bit like Scotland and the UK right now. If the Volus were to someday wish to declare their independence from the hierarchy, it may not be out of the question to assume that the Turians would use force to keep the economic resources that the Volus have provided them. It's obvious that the hierarchy is the dominant colonial power at this point in the game's history, with a seat on the Council and the strongest military force in the galaxy. Although the Alliance's expansion is remarked upon as being rapid, they're still fairly tame, especially when their main challenge to said expansion is a competing force. The Batarians are another Milky Way species, and unlike everyone else that we've met, they're particularly aggressive and have a society that relies so heavily on slavery that they've claimed that disallowing it would be an infringement on their cultural heritage. With all of these very fine examples to look up to, the familiar evils that the Alliance participates in hardly seem noteworthy at all, and by all accounts it's never even actually remarked upon. Shepard and company don't seem to pay any attention to the fact that they're all just wandering in this corporate hellscape built on the backs of imperialism. It's just part of the set dressing, and by making it such an intrinsic part of the setting, without allowing for room for commentary, it acts as a form of endorsement for this ideology. The only time that Mass Effect does get critical of the effects that colonialism has on society is with the Krogan, wherein a millennia ago, the pre-spacefaring species was uplifted for the sole purpose of fighting a battle that they had no previous involvement in. They were then sterilized when they perceived that they were being treated unfairly and a rebellion force was unleashed. There's a great deal of bioessentialism involved in discussions around these events, with the claims that the Krogan are inherently too violent to be allowed to reproduce unchecked. This is eugenics again, by the way, which, as I hope we've established, is very bad. And even when Commander Shepard is trying to help with a cure to the sterilization plague that has for centuries led to conflict and apathy and death among the Krogan people, those same talking points return to try and persuade you to sabotage them. This situation kinda reminds me of the way that Americans try to justify the dropping of the atomic bombs as a necessary evil, all the while disregarding the fact that Japan was already on the verge of surrender, and ever since they've been trying to calculate the potential loss of life against the reality of what actually happened. In BioWare's other mainstay series, Dragon Age, colonialism, racism, and the scars that those leave behind have a heavy impact on the setting, and eventually the narrative of the games. This is pretty typical of modern high fantasy, and it's something that's seldom given the care to be meaningful commentary. And from the nature of being a series of choice-based RPGs, BioWare almost goes out of its way to allow you to participate in some pretty heinous things. In Thetis, skin tone-based discrimination exists for no other reason than assholery. The key victims of this world, however, are the elves. Thetis' elves have been explicitly stated by the series' original lead writer as being indigenous and Jewish-coded, which, given their treatment throughout the series, is a pretty big problem. It's heavily implied throughout the games that their subjugation to humanity follows an almost invasion-esque arrival and later on an exalted march, which is the Andrasian equivalent of the Crusades. As a result of these compounding events, the elves of this world have been left in either of two states, or three if you consider enslavement by the Tevinter Imperium, which we probably ought to, although Tevinter will enslave just about anyone impoverished enough. But the first sees them being forced to live in ghettos across the continent's major cities, called alienages, where they're confined and treated like second-class citizens and left at the mercy of any racist human that might decide to be the biggest fucking asshole in the world. This treatment is even worse than the Empire of Orlais, a French-coded country where elves are essentially forced into servitude for the upper class and nobility. Orlesian alienages are frequently at the mercy of whoever holds power, and they're constantly at the risk of being purged as either a power play between nobles or as a message to anyone who might be feeling a bit rebellious. The non-city elves are called the Dalish. Very much indigenous and Romani-coded, nomadic clans of Dalish elves wander the spaces between human civilization and live off the land, doing everything in their power to preserve their culture through isolation from modern society and by exploring elven ruins in the hopes of finding artifacts and pieces of their history that they can reclaim. They believe in their own pantheon of gods and have distinct rituals with variations existing between clans based on whatever pieces of their history that they've managed to hold onto for the longest. Unfortunately, humans have come up with their own stereotypes and superstitions about the Dalish, including rumors that they sacrifice children for blood magic rituals, which, given the Jewish coding for elves, is really fucking gross. Oh god. On top of all of that, BioWare decided to make it entirely possible in each of the existing games to kill off entire clans of Dalish elves. And in some cases to do it completely accidentally, killing your family off screen with no note of it being made by anyone until a couple throwaway lines in the final DLC because the war table missions are impossible to complete without a mod to take out the timers, a wiki tab open to give you detailed instructions, and a candlelight ritual under a full moon. So, yeah. There are a lot of problems with the portrayal of colonialism in this series. Nonetheless, the fact that the games make it entirely possible to participate in the genocide of a severely endangered culture. There's also the matter of the Qunari. The Qunari are a race of large-horned, dark-skinned humanoids from the north who have been explicitly coded as people of color from their very first introduction to the series. The narrative is incredibly biased against them, with superstitions about invaders from the north and their frightening philosophy that could destroy society as we know it. This almost Red Scare-esque moral panic is kinda frustrating to see in this narrative, given that it took up until Dragon Age Inquisition to even get any of the finer details about those living under the Qun from the Iron Bull, and to tone down what actual threat exists to mainland Thetis. And there is plenty to scrutinize about the Qun and their practices, from the brainwashing process known as re-education to their breeding practices. But where this commentary fails so utterly is that none of those intimate details are disclosed to us until so much further into the series, and in general, no one on Thedas has enough knowledge about the Qun beyond the propaganda to establish their own critical opinions. It's a great deal of hearsay and chantry fear-mongering to ensure that no one seeks an alternative way of living. At least there's nothing going on with the dwarves, I guess. But now we've come to Trespasser. In Dragon Age Inquisition's Trespasser DLC, the story sees us chasing a Qunari plot to sow chaos in the south through ancient elven ruins, and as we do so, we uncover a great deal about the ancient Arlathan, the original elven civilization, and the true nature of the elven pantheon. It turns out that even before humanity came along, the elves were being subjugated, this time by their own people. Through the DLC, we come to learn that the gods were actually just ultra-powerful mages. These Evanurs, as they were called, enslaved their own people, branding them with Valasleen. These are the tattoos that the Dalish have adopted as a coming-of-age ritual and as a tribute to their persisting faith. The Evanurs were ultimately dethroned by one of their own who, now millennia later, wishes to restore the Elven Empire to its former glory, and in so doing, destroying the world as we know it. Whether this destruction takes the form of disruption and uprooting of society, or as a very literal cataclysm that will physically reshape the world and unleash abominations upon its civilians, elf, human, Qunari, and dwarf alike, is unclear. And my biggest critique with these reveals is that throughout the series, the Elven Pantheon is seen as something that is still being actively worshipped by the Dalish elves. In fact, apart from agnosticism, the Elven Pantheon may be the second most widely worshipped religion on Thedas, with the monotheistic chantry, very clearly a Christian analog, being the dominant religion of this world, going so far to invalidate the beliefs of an entire culture of people who are just desperately clinging to their endangered heritage feels kinda awful. A lot of players who play as Dalish elves have said that they felt like they were being shamed and belittled throughout this DLC. Players whose characters believe in the Maker can rest assured that there is nothing that can take away their faith, which kinda sucks, given that it's quite possibly a result of the chantry destroying elven culture that this knowledge was lost to begin with. It also feels incredibly victim-blamey, as though the elves were the ones responsible for their own downfall, and that somehow makes them deserving of the fate that's befallen their people in the centuries that have passed, which, given again what the elves are analogs for, is incredibly disconcerting and irresponsible. I'm not trying to imply that there is no merit in telling stories that explore race and politics in the way that Dragon Age does. Codifying the various peoples as analogs to real-life cultures can be a chance to show diversity and to give people the opportunity to see themselves represented in a way. But the way that Dragon Age has developed these narratives, and with their allowing the player to actively participate in behaviors that encourage bigotry, it feels mishandled and alienating. Trespasser came out in 2015, and after that, development for the next Dragon Age was put on hold while it was all hands on deck for Anthem and Andromeda. I'm not going to talk about Anthem in this essay because I tried playing it, and then I encountered a game-breaking bug 9 months post-launch that I couldn't Alt F4 out of, so oh well. But with the history of BioWare's contemporary titles ranging from apathetic to approaching maliciousness when it comes to colonialism, it's pretty fascinating to see where Mass Effect Andromeda now fits within this legacy. During the development period that our final game received, the world was starting to shift in some very intense and honestly terrifying ways, especially here in the States. And when it was finally released in 2017, the world that Andromeda came into was one that was particularly tumultuous. White supremacy began to run rampant, and organizations like BLM took to the streets to protest. It feels like anger was the emotion for the year from everyone, and it's fascinating to see that early in the year, before Wolfenstein 2 was even revealed, this honestly anti-fascist game came out with a message that wanted to be about hope. It's about connection and love and trying to be better than those who came before, even when you stumble along the way and make mistakes. Andromeda itself makes a lot of mistakes. That much is baked into it, just from the nature of its development. So much time is spent on creating justifications for the migration from the Milky Way, because almost none of the Initiative's members are even aware that they're running away from their own mass extinction event. The Reapers are only mentioned near the end of the game, after you've unlocked all of Alec Ryder's logs. G.N. Garson's vision was one that would instill in people a sense of adventure. The Leaving wasn't about self-preservation, even if in the end it may very well have ended up that way. Instead, it's framed as something that thousands of people chose to do in the name of exploration and discovery. To their credit, they did anticipate the chances of encountering sapient life when they arrived, and in Ryder's defense, first contact happened long before they got here. When the first group of Initiative members arrived in Andromeda to prepare for the Ark's arrival, a set of circumstances led to a rebellion of people who had lost their faith in those who had been left in power after nearly all of the organization's leadership was murdered. This culminated in dozens being forced into exile and the Krogan to leave the Initiative. These exiles found their way to a planet called Kadara. It was once an Angaran trading post, but as with everywhere else in Helios, the Kett's takeover left it in shambles. Led by the Nexus's former head of security, Slim Kelly, a group of exiles formed an organization called the Outcasts, and all but eradicated the local Kett presence before they took over the port. Sloan rules with an iron fist, taxing exorbitant fees for civilians to be allowed to stay within the port's walls. There's a massive economic disparity between the outcasts who control everything and the people who have been forced to live in the slums or further exiled into the hostile landscape beyond the gates. Sloan claims that she wants to appease the Angara who live on Kadara, but the reality is that she only cares for her people and no one else. Sloan is a character that I have a lot of mixed feelings about. On one hand, I understand the position that she's in, and it's definitely in the Exiles' best interest to have somebody on their side, given their valid grievances with the Initiative. But she's driving away those that she initially intended to protect, and is actively making life more difficult for those outside of her inner circle. The Collective doesn't exist in a vacuum. Their covert actions are a result of the danger of openly opposing Sloan, and there seems to be a more active place in this new group for Kadara's disenfranchised Angara. I do not like implying that the Angara here deserve the treatment that they've received due to their leaving the Resistance. Victim-blaming scared people in an impossible situation is irresponsible. They are refugees in their own home, and it's not like leaving Aya gave them any advantages. The Kett are still out there, and until recently, they were still being kidnapped for labor camps and exaltation. But this is where BioWare gives the players a choice in how they want to proceed. Do you allow the outcasts to remain in power, or do you allow for the takeover by the Collective and their shady leader? Choosing Sloan maintains the status quo, which is why I personally tend to side with the Collective, despite Reyes' deceptions. I will say now, being lied to is a perfectly valid reason to distrust someone and decide that they are not worth any of your time. But Reyes seems to be the more aspirational of these two, with his intentions of making Kadara a more equitable place to live. And given his existing relations with the Resistance, and his decision to make an Angara the Kadaran representative, it feels more in the spirit of cooperation that the game has been striving for. Kadara is a messy planet with a lot of morally questionable and morally gray shit going on. Either side that Rieder opts to ally with has its positives and negatives, which hopefully might be expanded upon in a sequel game. It stands as one of the game's main missions that provides us a place to examine what Rieder's role is here in this new galaxy, and to choose what shape that may take as we progress. Do you choose tenuous peace as a result of apathetic leadership, or do you choose a peace that's built with really shaky foundations and promises of something better, without being able to see what that might look like for everyone? This mission also provides some context for what the Angara's first experience with the Initiative was like, given the force that Sloan commands and the apparent ease with which they were able to take over the port. As much as the Nexus might want to separate themselves from the Exiles, they are still the same people who were loaded onto the Ark 600 years ago. And not all Angara have been as dismissive of their actions as the Resistance. One of the adversarial factions that the player gets introduced to in the story is the Roekarr. The Roekarr are a group of Angara with a somewhat extremist and xenophobic view of the Initiative as invaders, and given the takeover of Kadara, they're not entirely wrong. Their group is made up of people who have been particularly traumatized by the Kett, either having lost loved ones to fighting the labor camps, or who escaped captivity themselves. They attack Rieder and their team on sight. Even Jaardan gets shot at, since the Roekarr perceive the Resistance as traitorous for having allowed the Initiative to walk among them. To the Roekarr, the nuances and attempts at allyship don't matter. They are outsiders from beyond their known stars, no different from those that have enacted the genocide against their people and families for decades. And honestly, they're not completely wrong. The Initiative did come to Helios with the intention of settling, and Rieder has been actively terraforming the planets that they've landed on. That they're working to make these planets more habitable for both Angara and Initiative species alike doesn't matter. It is still a frightening amount of power for any single person to have access to. The vaults have already been poisoning planets for years, and though we don't find this out until much later, the network has been used as something like a weapon before. The Roekarr are led by a charismatic young man named Aksul. Rieder has the opportunity to learn more about him through Jaal. The two were once students under Moshae Sefa, learning from her what she knows about the Remnant. Aksul was the better student between the two of them, but he was later captured by the Kett and imprisoned in a labor camp. He freed himself a year later and became resentful of the resistance, seeing them as ineffective and noting their failure to save him as a key reason why. He formed the Roekarr shortly afterwards, leading his own fight against the Kett with varying results. The Initiative's arrival in Helios and the ousting of the Angara on Kadara bolstered the movement and solidified their position as being radically anti-alien. They fight with such fervor that they will choose death when faced against those that they perceive as adversarial. It makes it next to impossible to reason with those that Rieder comes across in-game, and it leads to a lot of unnecessary death as Rieder and their team defend themselves. The conflict comes to a head in Jaal's loyalty mission, wherein he is contacted by a few of his mothers, asking him to bring home 3 of his siblings who left to join the Roekarr. After asking Rieder to help him save his family, the team sets out to intercept them. This mission finds us in a place called the Forge, a sacred location thought to be the birthplace of Angaran civilization. It's empty and seemingly abandoned until we find Jaal's family and learn of the terrorism plot that Aksul has planned. He intends to destroy the Forge using materials stolen from the Initiative to frame them for the destruction of their sacred site, while using it as evidence to the Roekarr that they will do anything necessary to drive back the aliens. Though many attempt to stop us, we disarm the bombs and come face to face with Aksul. There are 2 potential outcomes to this mission, and the game makes it very clear which choice you should be taking, even if there is a bit of dissonance leading up to it. The confrontation with Aksul sees Jaal taking command of the situation and trying to talk down his old friend and the other Roekarr. Aksul continues to goad and provoke Rieder throughout, to the point of weapons being drawn. He wants you to perpetuate the violence that has led you here, to prove him right that the Initiative invaders are no different from the Kett. Jaal urges you to stay your hand, even when he accepts a gun to his head. It's at this moment that an interrupt appears. Unlike the original trilogy, interrupts don't have specific meanings attached to them, and are more about Rieder's impulse control. In this case, it's in your best interest to keep your finger off the trigger. Killing Aksul only emboldens the Roekarr, with you having made a martyr of their leader. If you choose to go down this path, then you later get chewed out by Ephra, and Jaal refuses to speak with you until after your next priority mission. Things are demonstrably worse for your relationship with the Angara for your having killed Aksul. The ideal outcome for Jaal's loyalty mission comes about by trusting him to know how to handle the situation that has put his family in jeopardy. He takes the lead in confronting Aksul, and though he doesn't get him to stand down, he does manage to unnerve Aksul to the point of throwing off his aim. The scars of this conflict are made literal as Jaal is shot, the bullet only grazing him but allowing the Roekarr to see how far they and their leader have fallen. They're hurting their families through their actions, and these radical acts of terrorism aren't the answer. As a result of this mission, Jaal is appreciative of his trust, and though he was hurt in the process, what he and Rieder have done will have a ripple effect that will prevent more people from getting hurt. Aksul messages Rieder shortly after that he still hates aliens, which, fair enough. But the Roekarr have been significantly weakened through his disgrace, and the Resistance is appreciative of the de-escalation. Or as appreciative as Ephra could ever be to Rieder. Aksul is a really fascinating character to include in this narrative, and I appreciate the role that he takes on in this game. He has been so thoroughly broken by the Kett, and his actions are completely understandable, especially because traumatized people don't always act in ways that make sense. It's obvious that there are others who have those complicated feelings that they need an outlet for. It's not just about Aksul having a honeyed tongue, it's about people feeling helpless and making reckless decisions to feel as though they have agency in their situation. Rejecting the Initiative and the Resistance's alliance is their way of finding that. And it's important for Rieder to face a group like this head-on and to choose nonviolence as their solution to the situation. It's through their interaction in this final stand that a decision is made about what their goals are, not just for themselves but for the Initiative as its representative. There have been promises throughout the game of the Initiative's dedication to cooperation and allyship, but as we saw with Sloane Kelly, even those dedicated can turn selfish and hostile under the right circumstances. Even though Rieder doesn't necessarily do anything but stand there, it's with this inaction that seals the assurance that they don't want to kill anyone. They're here to listen, to learn, and to find a path forward towards a mutually beneficial relationship that will provide both them and the Angara not only a fighting chance to defeat the Kett, but to forge an alliance that will continue to support each other into the future. What I appreciate most about this mission is that the de-escalation of the situation isn't a definite end to the radicalization. Emotions like this exist for a reason, and it would be dangerous to assume that this is the last we ever hear of radicalized Angara. There's a lot of blame passed to Aksul being manipulative, but the people that he recruited wanted to believe in what he said, and he gave them a place to act on their desires. The Roekarr were fighting for their people, even if the way that they did it led to innocent people like their families getting hurt. It'll be fascinating to see what the future holds for the Angara and what infighting might rise against the relationship to the initiative. So many storylines in this game are worth exploring, from what happens next in the war with the Kett now that the Archon has been killed, to the initiative's still blossoming relationship with the Angara. And beyond anything else, I am desperate to find out more about what the hell the Jaardan were up to and where it is they fucked off to. I really wanted to include a section on them in this script, but then I went through what information I have available and... y'all, there's so little. Fuck. I thought that they might be a good case study to bring into this discussion, but I just don't have enough to go off of to write a section. The discoveries on Meridian are paradigm shifting. Learning that the Angara were genetically engineered and seeded onto their homeworlds is just so much. But that's all that we have at this point. We're left with scraps of fragments of information and this itching curiosity to seek out what that might mean. Or if it's something that we're going to be stuck with, left to theorize after for the foreseeable future. I want to believe that we'll return to Andromeda someday. Despite all of the memes, and despite the occasional dissonance between the story and the gameplay, I do truly adore this game, and I'll be honest, it took me years to get here. Rieder wasn't the protagonist that I needed as a new adult, struggling with unaddressed trauma and working my third job since graduating from high school a year prior. But even back then, I went to bat for this game to defend it. I am really glad that there have been people who've taken the time to come back and see what's here beneath the fandom vitriol. And I do truly hope that Andromeda is able to set an example for BioWare's future titles going forward. I hope that this is a lesson about crunch, about having consistent direction, and that we can prevent future games from winding up like Anthem. I hope that they strengthen their anti-Nazi ideology and remind people that fascism is bad, because unfortunately that's something that we have to keep reminding people. And I hope that care is given to the victims of their worlds, instead of shaming them and creating justifications for why they deserve what they've got coming to them. At the time of writing and production, Dragon Age 4, aka Dreadwolf, is in a stage of development where it seems as though the blueprint has been firmly set, and the devs are building up the world to those specs. The ongoing pandemic has obviously caused some growing pains as the studio adapts to remote and hybrid development practices, but supposedly, we're getting more information about what the setting, plot, and characters will be by the end of this year. I'm glad that they seem to be taking their time and have ironed out the management and directorial wrinkles that plagued their previous two releases. However, I am still worried about the game's ability to handle the deep social narratives that have been set up over a decade and 3 games worth of world building, especially because we're headed to Tevinter, a nation with a population of darker-skinned individuals whose society actively participates in a slave trade. It's been really great to see queer diversity on the team, from the non-binary creative lead Patrick Weeks to trans women director Corinne Bush, but I really hope that there's more color behind the scenes than we've been previously allowed to see, because based on BioWare's dev spotlights, the Dragon Age team seems to be pretty white. Without more diverse voices involved on the team, it's hard to trust them to handle such tricky subject matter with the care that it requires. The next Mass Effect is still a massive mystery to us at the time of production. Though, since this video is being published on its 7th date, maybe we'll have gotten some fun stuff, but I'm not going to be able to edit that in. So far, we've been given a cryptic trailer starring a former companion, and a poster that was given to us to feed fan theories as to what the hell they could have in store for us. One of the devs has noted that there is a reason why both galaxies were present in the trailer, but given that we're still at least a few years out from any solid information, I'm choosing to remain skeptical as to what that might mean. There has been a particularly loud section of the fandom who want Commander Shepard to return, and I personally think that that would be a huge mistake. Shepard's story is over. Bringing them back would canonize one of the endings and cause a lackluster choice to become even more meaningless. Despite everything that's happened since its release, I do feel as though Andromeda left the franchise in a promising position, if only because it's taken the time to grow beyond its predecessors. It's a game that needed more time to become fully realized, but it's not bad as far as the narrative goes. There are so many storylines that we could track down, and Rieder and company are such an awkwardly charming cast of characters that I would love to get to see them grow further. Things since Andromeda's release haven't been perfect, but I do think that the game takes a lot of steps in the right direction, even when it trips on its feet here and there. There are a lot of lessons to be learned from this game, and the strides that it takes in handling sensitive subject matter counts for a lot. I really hope that BioWare continues down this path. This studio and its works have brought me a lot of comfort in some particularly dark times, and I found a home in this community that's given me lasting friendships that I'll never forget. In comparison to the rest of the AAA gaming industry, BioWare's made a lot of progress as far as representation goes, but there's always room for improvement. What was diverse 15 years ago isn't enough anymore. Expanding the diversity of their teams, from the narrative to the engineering departments, will go a long way to creating games that can tell rich, complex stories without being alienating. I'm really looking forward to what comes next. There's a lot of love that goes into these games from the devs to the players, and I really want to believe that they can grow. But until then, we are travelers, constantly moving forward and looking back. Alone and as one, we have no choice but to try. For our insatiable curiosity, for our fear of what may happen if we don't. We will say goodbye, and you will look back one last time, and know that wherever you go, we will be with you.
We made it.
Thank you so much for watching this.